Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 5, the final chapter of Little Blue Book number 1215, titled Robert G Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic. And it is written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. And we are doing Chapter 5, the final chapter. And it begins on page 55. Almost there. There it is. Okay, here we go. Chapter 5, Ingersoll's Personality. The character of Ingersoll will have been perceived by the reader throughout the preceding chapters. The stamp of his personality was upon everything that he did or said, and the impression is one that must engage the admiration of all. He never posed, and he disliked the idea of being written about. A writer who wished to include a sketch of him in a work on prominent New Yorkers, came to enlist his interest. Most men would have paid the author $50 or so. It is the age of the publicity agent. Ingersoll quietly asked him what the price of the book would be. It was to cost $10. Then said Ingersoll, "I will pay $50 and take 5 copies if you will leave my name out of it." He knew the worth of biographies. Writing once of such things, he said, "Washington is only a steel engraving. About the real man who lived and hated and schemed we know but little. Hundreds of people are now engaged in smoothing out the lines of Lincoln's face, forcing all the features to the common mold, so that we may be known not as he really was, but according to their poor standard as he should have been. As I showed in another book, 7 infidel U.S. presidents, Little Blue Book number 1203, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, and Lincoln, can be shown on the most absolute evidence to have been rationalists, and their more responsible biographers admit it. Yet most of America is astounded, and half of it is outraged when you mention the fact. They still are. Statesmen are peculiarly liable to have their portraits touched and idealized, but famous rationalists are just as liable to have their warts painted in where no warts existed. And we may be sure that no vices have been buried with their bones. Of Paine, as I said in Little Blue Book number 1205, Thomas Paine's revolt against the Bible, libelous lies appeared long before he had quitted the earth. And other prominent skeptics have had the same experience. Yet I am not aware that any libels were ever printed about Ingersoll. He was personally known to thousands, for he was one of the most accessible and sociable of men. He was one of the least secretive and diplomatic of men. He had malignant clerical eyes upon his career for decades, ready to magnify any weakness into a fruit of infidelity. But the devil's advocate gave him up. Honest Bob, he lived and died. And those who knew him still talk with enthusiasm of the charm and generosity of his personality. There was a spontaneity, a humanity in his actions, which one rarely finds in the public conduct of men who publicly profess high ideals. Once, after a rationalist lecture in England, I retired in broad daylight to the nearest bar. "Mr. Ingersoll would never have done that," said my companion. It appeared that Mr. Ingersoll, a well-known rationalist lecturer, became just as thirsty, but he would enter no bar within 5 blocks of the lecture room, lest his audience see him. It is the fashion of reformers. Ingersoll was never uncourteous or sanctimonious. He had once some business with a man whose virtue was his pride. Ingersoll questioned him, "Do you drink?" Do you chew? Do you smoke? There was a proud negative to each. Do you eat hay? Asked Ingersoll. And when the surprised man denied it, he said, Then you are not fit company for either man or beast. In his lecture on Burns, he said, instead of finding apologies for the poet's drunkenness, I would rather knock at the gate of St. Peter dead drunk and be able to say, I am Bobby Burns, than to own up that I was sober and a Presbyterian. A good youth was once boasting to him of the virtues of his father. My father was one of those who absolutely could do no wrong, he said. I guess you didn't know him, said Ingersoll. And there was no priggishness in his reply to certain politicians who thought his views on Christ very indiscreet. Gentlemen, it isn't to have you think that I would call Christ an illegitimate child, which hurts me. It is to think that you should think that I would think any less of Christ if I knew it was so. His quick sense of humor was a valuable aid to his oratory, and Smith's little biography, which is, as I said, the most valuable in its intimate account, is full of amusing stories. At a political meeting, some small Democratic interrupter goaded him at length to say, My Connemara friend, I am here tonight to kill the Democratic dog, but by God I have no time for the fleas. At another meeting, an old man just in front of the platform persisted in heckling him. Ingersoll poured his decanter of water over the man and said, Now, my friend, you go and dry up. On one of his visits to California, he was very much bored by the question from everybody he met, What do you think of our climate? It happened to rain heavily on the night of the lecture, and Ingersoll came on to the platform with visible signs of it. What do you think of our climate? He began. In trains, hotels, and streets, he had a laughing group around him. A clergyman insisted on arguing with him on a train and challenged him to name one particular in which he would have made creation better. I'd make a good health catching, Ingersoll said. Infant baptism was put to him in another place. At once he replied, I think it is a nice state of things when an infant babe must be held up by the feet, up to the light, to find God's watermark. He once sheltered under a tree with a Baptist deacon during a thunderstorm, and it occurred to the deacon that Ingersoll was a little nervous. I thought you didn't believe in God, he said. That was just a point, said Ingersoll. He would not be nervous if he thought that lightning guided, but I know it is not, and that it is just as likely to hit me as an old fool like you. At one place it was announced that he had a sore throat, and a local clergyman wrote to say that it was probably cancer and a punishment. Ingersoll replied that he didn't blame God for giving a sore throat to any man whose arguments he could answer. When a piqued lawyer in court insisted that his word would go as far as Ingersoll's, Ingersoll retorted, Yes, but it would not be worth a damn when it gets there. His generosity was as impulsive as his humor. People were surprised at the relatively small sum he left when he died, for he had for years made $100,000 a year. This was partly because he made unwise investments, partly because he spent money almost extravagantly on things for himself and his family, and partly because he had been in the habit of giving away about a quarter, it is estimated, of his income. A little blue book could be filled with authentic anecdotes of his generosity. Even in his kitchen there was always a cigar box containing money to be given away. Once he heard a street preacher make a virulent attack on him. The man was poorly dressed, and Ingersoll, whom he did not recognize, took him to a store and bought him new clothes. The man asked his name, and Ingersoll mischievously gave it. In his confusion, the preacher wanted to give back the clothes, but Ingersoll asked him, as a favor, to retain them. And the incident ended with the man turning the page. With the man confessing that he had been paid by a clerical organization to vilify him. The sight of a shoeless boy in winter would send his hand into his pocket, and he sometimes did not look at the note he gave. To one such boy he gave a $20 note, and had then not enough money to pay his own fare. His home was irradiated by his warm-heartedness and generosity. In Washington, to which he moved from Peoria in 1877 and later to New York, a story was current of a servant failing to get employment when she said that she had been at the Ingersolls. The lady would have nobody from so extravagant a home. Why, she says, I hear that on chicken nights there's a whole chicken for everybody. Yes, and for each servant too, said the girl. Ingersoll counted no cost and never asked prices. Honor and sobriety he esteemed above all things, but he would have none of the hypocritical or pedantic disdain of merely material things. He liked comfort, and said so, and no man spent more in giving comfort to others. To the members of his family he made no set allowances. He kept an open drawer, well supplied with money, and wife and daughters took from it what they wanted at any time, and were never asked to give an account. On one occasion, a Baptist congregation appealed to him for a subscription toward a new roof for their chapel. He gave one, but slyly added that he did not see why Baptists should mind getting wet. Good point. No man ever wrote more beautiful sentiments about home and love of wife and children, and no other man who ever wrote such sentiments was as sincere as Ingersoll. I guess here are some of them. In the air of kindness, your children will grow about you like flowers. They will fill your homes with a sunshine and all your years with joy. Right. If upon this earth we ever have a glimpse of heaven, it is when we pass a home in winter at night, and through the windows, the curtains drawn aside, we see the family about the pleasant hearth. I never passed such a house without feeling that I had received a benediction. And, do you know, it is a splendid thing to think that the woman you really love will never grow old to you. Through the wrinkles of time, through the mark of years, if you really love her, you will always see the face you loved and won. Dull. These things were not borrowed by Ingersoll, as Billy Sunday and other preachers borrowed theirs from Ingersoll, nor were they virtuosities of language carefully constructed in order to edify. They were spontaneous expressions of Ingersoll's emotions and experiences. He had a beautiful nature. He was, said the great leader of the women movement, Miss Elizabeth Cady Stanton, peerless among the great and good men of the 19th century. He was, said the exacting critic Clarence Darrow, a great soul of matchless courage, one of the great men of the earth. Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, highest judges of men, wrote superlatively of him. Andrew Carnegie coupled him with Lincoln. It could not be otherwise. Instead of shivering in a starless night when his creed went out, he found at once a new star. My gospel will cover the earth with happy homes. His creed he once thus summarized. I believe that happiness is the only good. I believe that reason the only torch. I believe that justice the only worship. I believe that humanity the only religion. I believe Oh, I believe that humanity the only religion, and love the only priest. I like that. That is the creed of all rationalists. These are the real fruits of infidelity. But all rationalists have not the finely balanced and generous impulse nature of Robert Ingersoll. And few have the great gifts that enabled Ingersoll to create such a home as his creed required and such responsive members in it. Years after his death, I found the famous Ingersoll home, with his widow, her sister, Mrs. Farrell, and Ingersoll's old publisher, Mr. Farrell, his 2 daughters, and his grandson and granddaughter, in New York, saturated with the Ingersoll ideal. My good friend, Mrs. Ingersoll Brown, who so fitly sustains her great father's ideal of service, will, I know, pardon me if I reproduce the only criticism I ever heard. It's too saccharine, said a friend to me. Few homes are ever described as too sweet. Yet temperamental caution and a large knowledge of biographies as means of concealing the truth made me still hesitant to think that Ingersoll's emotional passages were just a spontaneous outpour of a fine spirit until, when I had to write a large biography of George Jacob Holyoake, that's what we're calling it for now. Let me know in the comments. The British rationalist, who was nearest to Ingersoll in finesse of character, I came to handle a large number of Ingersoll's private letters poured hot from his heart. It was just the same language as in his great orations. He disliked and distrusted Charles Bradlaugh, and thought little of any other British or American rationalist of prominence, but he loved Hoyke. One of his letters to Hoyke answers those skeptics who blame him that he founded no organization to sustain his work. Okay, no need to look it up. It's Holyoake. I just did. Okay, here we go. Organization always brings envy and littleness to the front. It is easy to work for a cause, but it is generally hard to work with others. They become jealous and hostile. I want just as little as possible to do with folks. I do not care to lead, but I hate to follow the egotistic and idiotic. Boy, I like Holyoake too. He wrote that a few months before he died, every man who has had experiences analogous to his, whether in religious or anti-religious propaganda, knows the truth of it. Idealists are often bad cabin mates. Professional idealists are apt to be grafters and hypocrites. Ingersoll lived his great life and did his massive work alone. I am, he said, shortly before his death, thankful to know I have lived long enough to put the brand of inferiority on the intellectual brow of orthodoxy. He had. No man had, on quitting the world, less reason to repine or regret. The infidel deathbed legend is as incongruous as to attempt to fit on him as it would that doesn't make sense, as it would be to make a dying pope utter blasphemies. His end was as tranquil as that of any man that ever lived. Up to the night of July 20th to the 21st of 1899, he had no reason to think. He had no reason to think of death, or as even near his horizon. Some digestive trouble then gave him a restless night, and he was indisposed in the morning. He sat up at noon and proposed to lunch with the others. "How white your tongue is," his wife said to him. He looked at her, smiling, and said, "I am better now." And he sank gently back into his chair and died. What a way to go. And that's the end of chapter 5, thus the end of Little Blue Book number 1215, titled Robert G. Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic. Written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.